Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for another edition of What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us? It was very exciting because on Friday we actually got to meet each other in person live, and it was lovely. Jenny is as lovely as she comes across online. Johnny is still Johnny. Vicky was actually quite calm, really. Verity, who you can't see, she decided that she was having a COVID test and didn't want to meet any of us in real life. And look what happened to Keith. He's disappeared off the face of the earth, not been seen since we all sat together on Friday. So it all went well for us. We're joined by Tim Kruger from Oxford University. Don't Google him. You could have a bit of a shock, and we don't want to upset any of our viewers. But Tim is an expert. He's going to go on for absolutely ages, and he's going to answer all of Johnny's questions. And we're all going to try and come up with some really great ideas to make him wonder why he ever said yes to this. But it's brilliant that we've got such a brilliant guest, and that will all come very clear. This week, we're going to be trying to behave ourselves. We're not going to be talking about bad people. We're going to be talking about good people and disappointing people, maybe, Vicky, towards the end. But Jenny, because she can't be horrible about anyone, is actually now going to focus on policy and what's been going on in the world of climate change and sustainability. Jenny, thank you.
Thanks, Nick, for such a lovely introduction. I better keep things very positive in my policy and news summary. So today I thought I would it's a mixture of policy and news, but starting off with no particular chronological order, but the G7 summit. Hopefully everyone's aware that that was held in Cornwall on the 11th to 13th of June. We may hear a little bit more about that later in the programme today. There's not a huge amount to report from the G7. Lots of the articles I've been having a look at confirm that everyone was reaffirming existing commitments. And a key aspect that was being discussed in the news is the absence of an agreement of funding to help poorer parts of the world invest in green technology and adapt to extreme weather. Now, that's a key aspect which is going to be discussed and hopefully agreed at COP26 later in the year. But it's incredibly important, particularly in the context of historic emissions, and if we're looking across the globe at where responsibility for climate change lies. So hopefully we'll hear much more progress on that later in the year. A key policy update I'd like to give a mention is the policy in relation to nationally significant infrastructure projects, NSIPs, for anyone who's involved in the industry and knows the acronym. There is an amendment to the environmental bill, which means that they are going to have to be delivering 10% biodiversity net gain. Quite curiously, the government announced it in their response to the Descriptor review, which was earlier in the year. So that was the Cambridge University study on the economics of biodiversity. So it's quite a positive move, because before, any of these huge infrastructure projects were excluded from having to deliver biodiversity net gain. But as usual, when a new policy comes out, the question mark is what's going to happen in the intermediary period, and how is that going to apply to projects at which point in the system, the planning and delivery system. So we'll watch this space on that one. On the environment bill, not too much to report on that yet at the moment. It's still going through Parliament. It has been confirmed that a green paper will be published later in the year, focused on how we're going to conserve and enhance biodiversity in the UK. So again, that links quite nicely to what I was just talking about there. And there's also amendments being brought forward to reduce the harm from storm overflows to our rivers, waterways and coastlines. This has been climbing up the news in the last year or so. I don't know if it's partly in response to how much everyone's been taking to the water and enjoying open water swimming and realizing about sewage in the water, but yeah, interesting to see that being added as well. And the final one I was going to mention was the recent Committee on Climate Change reports. They published their independent assessment of UK climate risk earlier in June, which is not perhaps the most snappy title, but they've got some fairly hard-hitting commentary on the government and the fact that they don't think that we're taking enough action in general to look at warming and the effects of it on the UK. So there's warnings that there's going to be a lot more severe heat waves, especially in big cities, a lot more intense rainfall and increased flood risk across most of the UK. The report comments that homes, infrastructure and services must be made resilient to floods, heat and humid nights. And basically it's quite interesting from my perspective because there's a lot of focus at the moment on carbon reduction and climate mitigation. And I think this is quite timely because I think there needs to be more focus on climate risk in general. So yeah, that is my whistle stop tour of the news and policy. I'm sure I've missed some detailed ones, but those are the high level and big hitting articles I just wanted to talk about.
No, I think that's good. Considering that COP26 is going to, when it gets here, be the most dominant thing going, it is a bit slow of government, isn't it?
I think so.
I don't think they're doing very well. I'm disappointed in them. You'd think that every week they had another plank to policies. Also for the G7, it's unbelievable that they didn't come out with some statement of intent to start warming up that something was going to happen later on in the year. You know, is Biden coming back to make a big statement? Surely this was his platform.
Big question, isn't it? Is COP26 actually going to happen?
Well, we know the organising company that's got the contract, and they certainly hope so. As are busy in our office, so I hope that happens. But it is still, there still doesn't feel that there's that energy coming from central government and the mood music. And I thought G7 would be the start of it, but there we are. Johnny.
Well, it's a good segue, isn't it? Because we need people leading in this agenda who are thinking through these issues and really setting the standard for the big thinking that's needed. And I'm absolutely delighted that Tim Kruger has agreed to join us today. So I'm going to introduce Tim because I know he would say very humbly his background, but Tim comes from Cambridge University, where he did a degree in natural sciences, a degree that I know very well because it was the course that I wanted to do, and I went to my science teachers who laughed at me. So I went back to the UCAS book and looked for other things to do. Amazing course. He came out of that, and then over the last 15, 20 years, and I've known him over the last decade, and it's been an absolute delight to be working with him and know all the work he's doing. He has been the founder of a company called Dry Grow that delivers low water agriculture in Africa. Fantastic business that is delivering amazing things with reduced water consumption in that sector. He's the founding director, there's a lot of founding here, a founding director of Origin Power, which I'm sure we'll come on to a little bit later. I love the statement from Origin Power. Origin Power is developing technologies to profitably capture and remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is its mandate, that is what it's doing. It's amazing. He is also a fellow of Oxford University, Oxford Martin School in the Geoengineering Institute, or the Geoengineering Programme as it's now called. I've been the pleasure of him taking me around the facility, and what's amazing for me is to see proper scientists sitting there, almost alchemy-like, designing ways of removing carbon dioxide, starting off in the laboratory and taking that out into the field. So there's some real big brains in this market area that's really focusing on coming up with the answer as opposed to just talking about stuff. There's a point that committee scientists need to move on to delivery. Now from my perspective, Tim, and I've known you, as I said, for over a decade, and I don't think I've ever asked you this question, but what drives you? How did you end up in the position that you've ended up? Tell us a little bit about that story, because we have a lot of people who listen into this program that are young, starting off in their career, want to be in climate change, but don't even know where to start. So how did you get to where you are at the moment?
Okay, thank you very much, Johnny. Well, as you say, when I studied natural sciences, it was a long time ago. And at that point, there were no modules on climate change. It was like, yeah, climate change is happening, but just carry on with ordinary stuff, physics and chemistry and stuff like that. And it was only really by reading around more broadly that, you know, was aware of what was going on with climate change. And it was really, I had an interest in it, and I was working lots of different roles in industry and latterly in management consultancy. And I had an interest in climate change, but I didn't know how I could get involved. And then one of the jobs that I had as a management consultant was doing a piece of work for the Carbon Trust. And at that time, the Carbon Trust was this quasi-autonomous NGO that was tasked with reducing the UK's carbon emissions, making the transition to a low carbon economy. And what my role was to look at their portfolio of ideas and try and help them focus on what they should look at most closely. And I thought, oh, this is going to be really interesting. I'm going to see all the different ways in which we can tackle climate change. And I kind of opened the cupboard, and the cupboard was bare. Now, I wouldn't say it was completely bare. I mean, there were great things about wind and solar and all sorts of other kind of techniques that can be used to reduce emissions. But I recognized that it just wasn't going to be enough, that if we were to avoid dangerous climate change, we would need all of the things that we were thinking about, but we would need new stuff as well. We would need techniques to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's when I started looking at this whole area, and I decided I would get involved in it. And after about a year and a half of working kind of nights and weekends on it, I quit my job as a management consultant and got fully involved in working on how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
So when you got into that process and you opened Pandora's box, and we always talk about a sanctuary of elephants in the room, of all the different issues you've got in that space. How do you resolve the complexities of how bad the situation is? Are you somebody who reflects on, we're in dire straits, we need to do something, or do you reflect on, right, there is a problem, this is how we move it on?
Yeah, so I really try and be a right to left thinker. So I try and work out where it is we want to be and what it is that we need to do to get there. And I think that the kind of usual mode of thinking here is left to right. Where are we now? And then let's incrementally change what we've got in order to get to where we want to go to. And I think that's problematic, because then you constrain yourself with the thinking of what we have right now. And actually, what you see when you see the scale of the problem is, yes, we need all the things that we've got in the toolbox now, but we need to invent new tools as well. And I think when I started in this space, there were several things that struck me. One, promises were being made, but they weren't being kept. Another was the targets as to what we needed to achieve in order to meet climate stability kept creeping up. So I think it was in 2005 or 2007, the target was a 50% reduction by 2050.
Yeah, politically it kept on popping up, didn't it? It was 60%.
Yeah, and then in the Climate Change Act 2008, it was like, we'll have an 80% reduction by 2050. And these things just keep going up and up and up. And now we have this net zero target by 2050. And maybe it will be brought back to earlier than that, and maybe there'll be a net zero target by 2045. So the targets keep going up, and still we don't have the full understanding of climate sensitivity or feedback loops or things like that. So the consequences could be far worse. At one point we were talking about, well, maybe we should, 2 degrees should be the target, and now the target's 1.5 degrees. So the targets are getting tighter, the timelines are getting shorter. We can only achieve that if we massively not just boost our ambition, but actually take the action to meet that ambition.
So in that toolbox, we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And let's specifically, I want to get into geoengineering from your background, from the program that you work at the Oxford Martin School. Just to explain a little bit about what geoengineering is and what the whole broad church and how that plays a part in this. And we'll get into netting out the emissions in a second, because I just want to explore what we're talking about here in terms of the slightly more kind of far out stuff to some of the more kind of like pragmatic, we can do this tomorrow stuff.
Sure. So the first thing, the best thing, the thing that we should do most is cutting emissions. And there's lots of different ways in which we can do that, using less energy or energy that emits less, or if it does emit, capturing that CO2. But we may need to go further. We may need to do more than just that. And so there are these range of proposed techniques called geoengineering, and it's a relatively modern term. So different people interpret it in different ways. But the kind of broad sphere is 2 different classes of techniques. One of which is about reflecting some of the sun's light back into space to cool the planet. So we've overheated it a bit, and we will continue to overheat it with our climate change, what we're doing to cause climate change. One proposed technique is to basically increase the reflectivity of the planet in various ways by putting stuff in the stratosphere or brightening clouds, and that would reflect some sunlight back. So think of it as a kind of big shade. It's a hot day, you have a sunshade that cools you down. So that's one class of ideas called solar radiation management. And then the other class of ideas is called greenhouse gas removal. And that involves taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Primarily carbon dioxide is what people are looking at. So do you want me to go into them a little bit more, Johnny?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And then also talk through that process to how you get to what you're doing at Origin Power, because it does link back into what, a large part of our audience come from a land development background, who are looking at decarbonising their supply chains and material supply chains. So it'd be good to go down that road. Absolutely.
Sure, absolutely. So if you look at these two broad areas, solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal, the one that's probably more controversial is the one that's known as solar radiation management. And this involves cooling the planet by reflecting sunlight back into space. And this, if you run the climate models and you assume that you can brighten the planet by X%, 1 or 2%, then you can cool the planet and get back to a world which is less perturbed than the one that is expected with climate change. But it comes with a whole host of potential issues. And those issues are primarily kind of social and political. So the first question is, whose hand is on the thermostat? How much do we turn that dial to cool the planet down? And do we feel comfortable about the idea of someone having that power to actually control the climate in that way? And then there are a whole host of other issues about, well, what would happen if you stopped applying this technique? It's a question called determination risk, which is if you have the level of CO2 climbing up and up and the temperature climbing up and up, you could tamp down that temperature with solar radiation management. That's the theory. But then what happens if you stop doing that solar radiation management rapidly? Well, the temperature would bounce back up very quickly. And so there is a risk that we could attenuate risk now, but essentially you would be putting future generations in more risk. Now, this is a very simple overview of it, but there is a lot of concern around ideas which you would you'd start now and you'd have to implement them permanently, otherwise there would be dire consequences. And so I think that politically and socially, this is something that would be very difficult to implement. It's not to say that it would never be implementable, because we also have to think of the risks that it is being considered used against. So in a future where temperatures are rising very rapidly, and you could get temperatures which are frankly unlivable. What's known as the wet bulb temperature, the temperature that we feel as heat, which is a combination of heat and humidity, can rise to a level where people just can't survive. They will basically cook alive. They won't be able to lose heat through sweating, which is the normal way that we do. And so in those circumstances, you could actually see large parts of heavily populated countries like India becoming too hot to actually physically live in. And in those circumstances where you're looking at tens of thousands of heat stress deaths, then you might want to consider what else you could do. So solar radiation management is not something that people are grasping at as a first option, but it is something that people are considering because the circumstances may be so dire that there are great consequences of not doing it. The other class is carbon dioxide removal, and this covers a wide range of different ways in which we can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So again, the best thing is not to put it up there in the first place, but ultimately it's pretty inevitable we're going to overshoot a safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we will need to pull that down. And there are various different ways you can do it. So Johnny, your background, I know it's not where you really are right at the moment, but your background has got trees, and trees are a great way. As they grow, they absorb carbon dioxide, and that's great. So from a land management point of view, planting lots of trees draws down carbon dioxide. But the issue there is those trees don't live forever. And so they will only lock up carbon dioxide for the time that you've got that those trees are alive. And so what you need to do is have permanent solutions. I'm going to pause there because I don't want to lose you, but there are lots of other techniques as well.
Yeah, we're with you. And the other thing with kind of rewilding tree planting that we often forget about is in the UK context, we're taking agricultural field that probably used to be woodland that we cut down, and actually by rewilding it, we're actually just bringing it back to the baseline that was. You know, the baseline, we always talk about a baseline from an emissions point of view in the UK has been 1990. Actually, it was probably about 80 AD before we started cutting down all the woodland for farmland. So tell me a little bit more then in terms of the approaches now that you're looking and what you're doing with Origin Power in terms of the process, and keep it simple, because my chemistry is still back at the days when my chemistry teacher told me no to Cambridge. And how that plays into the kind of the next steps of the new evolution of what we need to be thinking about in terms of netting out emissions.
Sure. So as I said, there's a wide variety of ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Trees is one of a number of biological routes, and all those biological routes essentially use photosynthesis that takes CO2 out of the air. But the really important thing is that you need to store that carbon permanently. Chop the tree down, burn the tree, the CO2 goes back up in the air. You haven't solved the problem. So you need something that's permanent. And what I'm working on is a non-biological route, a kind of technical engineering route. And this is based around the lime cycle. So you start off with limestone, and that's calcium carbonate. You heat it up, and that breaks down the calcium carbonate into calcium oxide and carbon dioxide. And at this point, you're probably thinking I'm nuts because it's generating carbon dioxide, and I thought that's not what you were trying to avoid. But we do this in a way that generates the CO2 in a pure form, and that actually makes it very easy to sequester it, to bury it permanently underground. So you've got rid of that carbon dioxide, and you've got some lime, calcium oxide, and just exposing that to the air, that will react with the CO2 in the air to reform calcium carbonate. And so what we're doing is we're going round and round that cycle, starting with calcium carbonate, stripping off the CO2, burying it underground. That makes it basically a chemical magnet for CO2 from the air, strips the CO2 from the air. Each time you go around, you're taking CO2 out of the air.
So it becomes, do you describe that as carbon positive or is that carbon negative? I always get confused between those two.
Yeah, I would call that carbon negative. So the kind of processes where we're burning fossil fuel are pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. Things like wind power and solar power, let's have more of those. I'm all in favor of those, but they're carbon neutral. If we overshoot a safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to have to do more than that. We're going to actually have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and do it permanently. And to give you an idea of the kind of permanence thing, when you plant a tree, it grows, and then it gets chopped down, it dies, etc. But the lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere is in the order of hundreds of years. So you have to store carbon for at least that time period. The lifetime we need to think about is the lifetime of the carbon, not just a few decades. It has to be centuries. And that's why techniques that can store the carbon away permanently really are the best way of approaching this.
So I've hogged you now for nearly 20 minutes, but before I pass you on to Vicky, Nick and Jenny to ask some probing questions, I just wanted to pick something up with you with regards to something you recently brought forward that grabbed my attention, and that's the concept of the Great Restoration. Now, I've had, is it a delight, or I don't know whether it's a delight, I've read every nationally determined contribution statement made that's been lodged up on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There you go, said it first time. And very, very few talk about removal of CO2. A lot of nature-based stuff, which is fantastic, lots of renewables, lots of hydrogen, stuff like that, but very few talk about geological, geo-capturing type process. We appear not to, and in the UK as well, not to have a net zero strategy that includes the removal part of the equation. And then I read your Great Restoration paper. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay,
because this is the big thinking, Nick, you talked about. We seem to be void of big thinking. So Tim, tell us about the Great Restoration.
Okay, so the UK should be proud of the fact that it has this net zero target. It led the way as being the first large economy to do that 2 years ago. But we need to back up that ambition with action. And I think one could charitably describe the policy on removals, which is what you're going to need to have in order to get to net zero, as emergent. It hasn't quite emerged yet. It is in the process of being developed. And that's a pretty difficult position for people who are developing the technologies to actually operate in, because you can say, well, we could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it's not worth it. There does need to be some incentive to actually make that worthwhile. So there needs to be this ambition to remove CO2, but we need to have the incentives. But what I wrote recently was something called a concept called the Great Restoration. And that is that this isn't just about restoring the atmosphere. That is something that we should do. We should draw down the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere back to a level which is compatible with a stable climate and healthy oceans. And this is a huge, huge undertaking. So to give you an idea, at the moment, the UK emits about 450 million tons of CO2 per year. But we have a backlog, historical emissions of about 78 billion tons. Yeah. So even if we get to net zero, yeah, I can see your face, Vicky. Even if we get to net zero by 2050, by that time we'll be way over 80 billion tons of kind of historic emissions. And really, if we want to get back to where we ought to be, that's what we're going to need to take out of the atmosphere. So it's a huge kind of carbon debt, carbon hangover that we have as a country that developed relatively early. So we need to restore the atmosphere. That's going to be a multi-generational endeavor. You could describe it as a cathedral project in that those people who are involved in its inception might draw up the plans and dig the foundations, but they'll never raise the spires to their full height because they won't live to see that day. But they need to start in the hope that future generations will be able to finish the job. What we have is a need to restore the atmosphere, to draw down CO2 levels to a safe level. But we also need to think about restoring nature, improving biodiversity. We need to think about how we can do this in a way that is congruent with other societal goals. So it shouldn't be that we're restoring biodiversity at the expense of human rights or something like that. We need to work across the entire piece. We need to have that ambition. When we are in a kindergarten, you learn to play, have a mess, make a mess, but then you tidy it all up before you finish. And that's kind of what we need to do with our interaction with the environment. Not just the atmosphere, not just nature, not just socially, but all together. And that will be a massive undertaking for many generations. We as a species have made a big mess of this planet, and we need to work hard to undo that mess.
So yeah, I think you can look onto, is it on the Oxford Martin website, that article?
I'm not sure if it is yet. It's in the conversation. So okay. if you have a look on the conversation. By the way, if you Google me, don't worry. You need to have your adult filters on, because I share my name with a German actor of the adult variety. And no, that isn't me moonlighting, but just so you know, yeah, if you put Tim Kruger Oxford, you won't get that particular thing. But just do be careful with your filters.
Yeah. So Jenny, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. That was incredibly fascinating to hear about all of these big solutions that you've got, and it was very helpful for you to run through what's needed first. We need to cut emissions first, but we also need geoengineering. One interesting thing you said is that we will be overshooting our carbon emission targets. I'm not sure if you were referring as a planet or if that was focused on the UK. I'd be interested to hear what you think is needed to really boost ambition in the UK and move to where we've got more action and where we're sort of seeing things progress at a faster pace? What do you think we need to do as a country?
So I think we need to have that ambition. We need to make it. I think it's a combination of things. I think one is about having kind of regulated targets, and we see this in areas like cars being transitioned from internal combustion engine to electric, and we also see it with decisions around implementing policies that say we need to have hydrogen boilers or heating that doesn't involve natural gas by a certain date. So that's kind of strict regulations telling you what you can and can't do. But then you also need incentives, sticks and carrots. So sticks, prices to drive behavior, and carrots in order to incentivize good behavior. So they say there are three things you need: sticks, carrots, and sermons. So the sticks are about punishing bad behavior, the carrots about rewarding good behavior, and then the sermons are about trying to get people to change their behavior through basically preaching at them. And all three of those are required and necessary. But I think what would be most useful is to have a common price for carbon throughout the economy. And so a lot of economists will tell you we need a carbon price, but they don't really focus on how you achieve that or what can be done. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting and exciting about, if you can develop techniques to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that actually gives you a price for doing it. Now, we can't do it for $100 a ton yet, but I think that is a realistic target in the future. So if you can develop techniques that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere in a safe, robust, and scalable way for $100 a ton, then that becomes the carbon price. And then if you emit a ton of CO2, you either have to pay $100 a ton for someone else to clean it up, or you have to clean it up yourself. So carbon dioxide is this interesting pollutant. If you do clean it up in a permanent way, and there are lots of dodgy offsets, so I'm not talking that, but if you clean up the CO2 in a permanent way, then it doesn't actually do harm. You shouldn't emit it in the first place, but if you do and you clean it up, you're not the worse for it. But you have to have an incentive which is incentivizing people to develop these technologies and deploy them, and you also need to have a penalty for people who are emitting. And you see this kind of thing happening with waste management, so that there is producer responsibility obligations. So if you are producing packaging waste, then you have to pay for it. And if you are someone who is recycling that packaging waste, you get paid for it. It's a transfer of wealth from polluter to depolluter. And we need something similar in this space with carbon dioxide.
Nick, how are you dealing with all of that? There's the big numbers there, weren't there?
Yeah, incredibly big numbers, and quite fascinating for someone. I don't live this world like Johnny does, where he gets very excited about all these numbers. I walk in and go, no, that can't be true. It is quite terrifying. What sort of timeline? There's two things really, I suppose. Is what sort of timeline do you think the world is going to be so hostile in heat that your vision of India would actually start to become a reality? Because it's something that, because I've read a book recently, Bill Gates goes about, and it's about actually climate change is about allowing us to continue to thrive on this planet.
Was it this book?
It was that book.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I was just leaning down to
Yeah, I was about to do the same as well.
I
I took the cover off mine though.
But that really hit me when that book was about the time when we can't thrive because it's become too hot. People keep going 1%, 2%. What's your thought about that timeline at the moment?
I'm by no means an expert in this, but I understand it's kind of the latter half of this century, kind of 2080, 2080s, 2090s, that kind of timeline. It will depend on two different things. It will depend on how much we emit before then, and it will also depend on climate sensitivity. So This is, the first one is under our control. The second one isn't. It's basically spinning the roulette wheel, and we might end up with, we only get a small amount of increase in temperature for the amount of emissions we put into the atmosphere, or if we're unlucky, we might get a huge increase in temperature and lots of feedback loops and things like that. But it's looking at like the 2070s, 2080s, 2090s is when that kind of thing could actually happen. And obviously that's really, really dire. There is sorry.
Home is that's my son is 14 now.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's 64, just a little bit older than me now, he could be facing a climate, and it's just trying to bring it into reality. Because one of the things that I think I've just been dealing with a lot of people who have felt that sometimes the projections of the next wave of COVID have been over exaggerated to scare people.
Mm-hmm.
And the models could well have been true
Mm-hmm.
time when they were doing the modeling. But sometimes the public are getting a little bit sort of, well, is that to scare us or is it real? Because the reality is immensely scary.
Yeah. So I think in a way, it's very difficult to say how accurate these things are in the future. I mean, they're the best efforts of a lot of brilliant brains to try and get it right. But you're right, nobody knows exactly how bad it's going to be. If anything, I think there is a degree. So there are two kinds of climate models. You've got the ones that predict what temperatures are going to be, and they're based on kind of physical equations, and you can kind of test them, and they're pretty good at predicting things going forward. And then there's something else called integrated assessment models, which are about how we're going to implement technologies and where we can go with them. And if anything, I think those are way too optimistic. They assume that there will be a take-up of technology at a very, very rapid rate, and that emissions will fall very dramatically. And I am deeply skeptical about that. And again, these are what I would call left to right models, where they're going, we just need to implement more of the technologies we've already got. And yes, we do need to implement more of the technologies we've got, but we need new technologies as well. We need to as one of my colleagues, former colleagues said, he said, the most surprising future would be a future without surprises. We actually have to accommodate the fact that there will be surprises on the upside and on the downside to do with climate. But in terms of dangerous climate change, people say, is 1.5 degrees dangerous, is 2 degrees dangerous? Well, if you are living in as a subsistence farmer at the moment, and you are experiencing climate change, as many people in the world are, it is already dangerous. You are already impacting your livelihood. So is it now? Is it 1.5 degrees? Is it 2 degrees? They're all dangerous. They will just be more dangerous to more people and more species the further up that scale you go. And the evidence is that 1.5 would be really pretty bad. 2 degrees would be even worse. And beyond that, it gets worse and worse and worse. Sorry to be cheerful.
Happy Monday, everybody. Vicky.
Can I carry on the cheerful? Actually,
yeah.
I mean, listening to what you said, I mean, I recently did a climate science little course from the University of Exeter, just to try and understand, this, because I don't want to come at it from a position of a Luddite, but a lot of this stuff is so clever, and it's so science fiction. It's so sort of disaster movie stuff that I worry that the average guy in the street who's struggling to understand that they really need to wear a mask right now is going to be able to cope with this, and instead will just go la 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 la, not interested. So I get your point about the carrots, the sticks, and the sermons, and people like us love listening to what you're having to say. But I don't know how my dad would cope with it. And I think he would potentially just decide to just ride his motorbike a bit faster. So I'm interested to know how we deal with that. I love what you're saying about the stuff, the surprises, because I did some work with schools a few years ago, and remember saying to the children, 9 out of 10 jobs they'll have when they leave school haven't yet been invented. So that is so true. But I'm worried about escapes of the carbon. So you talked about the sort of radiation filters, and once we put the umbrellas up, we got to keep them up. What about when we lock away all this carbon and then somebody sort of knocks a hole into it and it all escapes? I've got a scheme in my local area where they're looking to build a solar farm which will generate the power to create hydrogen, but they're looking to do it on a former landfill site. And the objectors are saying, hang on a minute, what about if you knock through to the methane and release it, and then you have an impact where your hydrogen and the methane, and so people are getting really muddled by all of these. Are we going to end up with a worse problem, releasing all these toxins into the air? How secure is this locking away?
Okay, so you've asked me a number of questions there, and I'll try
about that. I tend to do that.
Address them each in turn. So the first one was around how do we communicate these complicated issues to a wide variety of audiences? Well, we've got to try, and I think that we've got to recognise that different arguments will appeal to different people, and also there are some people for whom no argument will appeal. Their minds, their ears are closed. But we need to do more than just preach to the choir, and I'm guessing that the audience to this webcast is the choir, people who are already interested and committed, but we need to go beyond that. And I think that we need to highlight both the perils of inaction, but also the potential for action, because I think there's a real danger that people just get pessimistic and just say, well, there's nothing we can do. So there's what is known as moral hazard, and this is one of the big problems with these proposed geoengineering techniques, is that people go, oh, well, if you can solve the problem, we don't need to worry. I can just buy that 4x4 I always wanted. And they're like, no, that's not the point. We need to do this and that. We need to do both of them. This isn't an excuse for action. So that's what's known as moral hazard. And then there's the flip side of that, which is called morale hazard, which is where you paint such a gloomy picture that people go, oh, well, let's just party. The Titanic's going down, so let's just have a good time. So you've got moral hazard and morale hazard. And basically, we need to try and avoid both of those. But what we can't do is we can't manage. We can't go out there and say, well, let's just tweak this figure to make it just about probable so that we can do it, or let's tweak that one so that people don't get too optimistic about it. You can't have that kind of management of hope. Yeah, you've got to be realistic as to what the hope is, but you have to communicate that yes, you need to do more, but you actually need to do more in order to get there. So that's the first thing. The second one was about jobs in the future are going to be different, and I think that's entirely true. We go back 50 years and look at what jobs were and what technologies existed. It's going to be so different in 10, 20, 30 years time. And I've got a couple of daughters, and they say exactly the same thing. I don't know what I'm going to do because career market's going to change, and that's their excuse for inaction. So I'll let them get away with that. And then the final point you were making, what was that? The final point?
The risks of locking it away and actually then making it a whole lot worse by release.
Yeah. So it's something you have to be very careful of, and you need to plan up front. So when I assess proposed techniques for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, I have these criteria: safe, robust, scalable. And by safe, I mean, hopefully it won't kill anyone, but also from a kind of social and political perspective. Is it something that is acceptable? Robust, will it actually work? Will it take CO2 out of the air overall? Because sometimes these techniques don't. If you're releasing landfill gas while you're trying to do something good, that's not going to help. But also, does it store the carbon away permanently? And so, of the biological routes, whether it's making biochar or getting carbon into soil or growing forests or things like that, you need to ask the question, is that permanent? Will that stay there? Will it get burnt? Will it get chopped down? Will the climate changing mean that the soil gives up the carbon that you stored in it? Because if that happens, you haven't moved forward. You're not going anywhere. And in fact, you could go backwards. The same applies for when you inject CO2 underground, and you need to make sure it stays there permanently. And Of course, if you do it badly, it can leak back out. But if you do it well and you monitor it well, you can be very confident that it will stay there permanently. When you inject CO2 deep underground, which is carbon sequestration, which is what people are planning to do beneath the North Sea, you're putting it many miles underground. There's cap rock over it. The CO2 goes down there and it will get trapped both physically and chemically. It will actually turn into mineral underground and it will stay there permanently. So yes, if you do it badly, if you drill a hole, put the CO2 down and forget to put the cap on, it'd be a bit daft, but you could do that, then yeah, it will leak out. But if you make sure you put the cap on and it stays down there, then it will actually solidify into a new mineral and it will stay down there.
Happy, Vicky? Yeah. Good. Get the cap on it.
Yes.
Leave it down. So just finally then to wrap up, before we get on to our next piece, just want you to wrap up under this conversation of the fear of having the conversation about netting out. So we have mitigation, we have the look, let's build renewables, let's avoid more emissions. And that is challenged against the conversation about adaptation, that do we need to move up the hill?
Mm-hmm.
And then in addition to this, we're saying, and we need to remove. Can you help? Because a lot of people struggle with those three things because they appear to be competing with each other.
Mm. Well, I think they're all part of the solution. So it's not, yes, in a sense, they are competing with each other for attention and resources, but they're all part of what is needed. So if you go back to the early 2000s, people were talking about mitigation, and then some people were saying we need to talk about adaptation. So mitigation, reducing emissions, avoiding the problem. And prevention's better than a cure, and adaptation was seen as, well, that's what you do if you failed at mitigation. So let's not talk about it. We just need to put more effort into mitigation. But that is disregarding the fact that people are already suffering, and more people will suffer because of the effects of climate change. And so you need to adapt as well. It's no good just saying, well, forget about the people suffering, we're just going to focus more on mitigation. You need to do both. And that was a conversation that took place in the early 2000s and has now moved to the point where people say, of course you need to do adaptation as well as mitigation. And then a similar thing is happening now with removals. So in a time when the target was an 80% reduction by 2050, you could kind of squint at the models and go, well, if you try really hard, you can get to 80% reduction without having to have any removals. You'd have to be chronically optimistic to believe that, but you could actually kid yourself that could be done. But once you get to a net zero target, what that means is you have either got to kill everybody on the planet, or you have got, which I'm not recommending, by the way, or yeah, thanks. Or you've got to recognize that for every emission that there is, you need an equal and opposite removal. And therefore, you are going to need removals. So once you kind of flip that conceptual switch of 80% isn't enough, we need to get to 100%. And if you're going for 100%, well, then you're going to need removals for whatever you're emitting. Then it suddenly changes it. And you realize you're only going to get to net zero if you have some form of removal technique. And I think the debate is now kind of shifting from, well, okay, we need removals, but we can probably do it all with nature-based solutions. And I think that is unrealistic because we have many other uses, not just us, but other species have many other uses of the photosynthetic capacity of the planet, which actually isn't going to be enough to counter all the emissions that will remain at the end of it all. So we need to look at a broad suite of ideas to address this. So yeah, it is a thing that is shifting, it's over time. It's, when I first started being involved in this about 12 years ago, I described it as a lonely and frustrating experience. It's now developed into a crowded and frustrating experience. So, progress of some sort. but there's still a lot that needs to be done, and we do need to focus, yes, on mitigation, yes, on adaptation, and yes, on removals as well.
Fantastic, Tim. That's been amazing, and the Great Restoration is a fantastic concept to bring this all together. So thank you very much for your time over the last 45 minutes explaining all of those. Do stay on for the last 10 minutes. Nick, back to you.
Well, Tim, when we started this webinar series, we had an idea that we'd find some interesting people, and you just brilliantly, I think you should be on every talk show, every TV show. I think you've just got it in trying to explain to people that, you might be wrong by a few years, but it's pretty serious and you better wake up. So thank you for that. And you do it in a style that is very difficult to say no. That's not possible, which I think that is something that we're always fighting against. So Vicky, you can start off with something nice, or you're going to go straight in for a little bit frustrating and annoying?
Well, I thought I'd finish on a high, so I think we'll start with the disappointment. So we're trying to be a little bit less angry, a little bit less critical than perhaps we usually are, because I get into trouble for this. But so we had the G7 this year, and clearly you've got to travel around the world. It's quite difficult to travel around the world, in a way that doesn't involve emissions. So we have to accept that planes, trains and automobiles and whatever else it takes. But I have to say, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of disappointment in the behaviour of some of the attendees who perhaps didn't choose the most environmentally sensitive means of travelling to something where they were going to talk about environmentally sensitive matters. So you can see, Johnny, I'm not doing very well here, am I? I've just got to cut to the chase.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we had a situation where we all know the most polluting means of travel, short haul flights of less than 300 miles. And we had people who were flying 251 miles. I mean, in an area whereby you can travel on an electrified railway line in precious more time, in 4-ish hours, than it would take, to fly. So why would you do that? What message does that send out?
Just, Vicky, just to give you some stats here. So if you fly business class, the average carbon footprint is 0.4 kilograms of CO2 per kilometre per passenger. If you fly in economy, it goes down 0.15, because as you know, in economy, well, as I know in economy, you're crammed together in the back with everybody else. And if you were to take a rail journey in the UK, it's actually averaging out at 0.03 kilograms of CO2. So you can see the scale, can't you, between the two, and why travel choice is so important when considering your carbon impact, because ultimately using the electrification of the rail system, public transport has a significantly lower carbon footprint than personal travel choices.
Name them.
I can give you some more. Let me give you some more figures, okay? So let's assume that you were travelling from Westminster to Carbis Bay. You can Google this. You can put it into a website, and the travel by plane would be. And this includes your transfers from Westminster to I think it's Paddington and whatever, right? The kilograms of CO2 emitted by the journey, 25.6 if you travel in the most efficient way, i.e. the train. To travel by plane is 127 kilograms of CO2. And the only element of the journey which is slightly more negative by train is ozone emissions, but that's more to do with summer smog as opposed to anything else. So, come on. And I mean, the other thing that I think they really missed by not traveling by rail is, would you not think that our great and glorious leaders would not like to see the countryside that they are ruling over, rather than the upper atmospheric areas, which is obviously a more polluting place to put your emissions than at the ground level. So, so that's my negative. And it's worse, Nick, it's worse than that, because
couldn't be.
4 o'clock on the Saturday afternoon in my garden here in Dorset, what flew over but 9 jets as they went to do a Red Arrows performance, which they all oohed and ahed with their glasses of champagne, which sort of just sends a bit of a bad message, you know?
Now, I'm presuming that my information is true, that Madge, 94, did the train, I heard. She went to dinner on the train.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're fine.
I mean, it would make sense, wouldn't it?
The train. So,
you know, so I think that was a bit disappointing. And if we're asking our leaders to you know, set a good example and be influencers, it's not really. I mean, it's a bit like last week, isn't it? You know, it's the do as I say and not as I do that I think is rather disappointing. Okay. So from that, I can go to the positive. So I have a lovely story.
Nice. Good.
So I want to share with you my heroes of the month. Have got to be the children. Okay, so there's a story this week that National Grid are starting a competition called Voices for the Future, and there is a link to COP because the winners of this competition are going to be making a video which will be recorded and presented to the delegates at COP. They interviewed 1,500 children aged, I think, 7 to 13. 80% of those children said they believed it was their responsibility to do something about climate change and take responsibility for the planet. 83% of them believed that the grown-ups were not doing enough. So that was quite scary. And 1 in 3 of those children had had nightmares about climate change. That's without hearing about Tim's, you know, crazy things.
Yeah, we're going to have to put a warning on the beginning of this.
I've already been working on this for a dozen years, but still my kids would fall into that category that their parents aren't doing enough. So
yeah, but
even you.
None of us are doing enough, are we? Really? But I think they came up with the top 5 reasons, the top 5 things that they thought we should be doing. And I have to admit, you know, 4 of them related to travel, but which are all rather fun. 1 is to increase travel by trampoline. The second is to increase travel by jetpack, which, you know, I think is probably a bit more realistic. Chocolate powered trains, they liked that, and hamster powered trains as well. So, nice. You know, there's lots, but there is 1 there which I think every parent will join with their children in saying this has got to be a good thing. And that was a ban on homework because of the impact on the level of paper. So, you know, I thought that was really great. And I just think, you know, big up to the children who finally, it feels like there are big organisations like National Grid who do want to listen to what the children have got to say. So let's just hope that the COP26 listen as well.
I've got a friend who does some kind of engagement with school kids about climate change, and he kind of presents what climate change is, and then he says, okay, come up with some ideas. And the 2 favourite, well, kind of not favourite, but is 1, kill all the cows, was one of them, and the other one was put out the sun, was another one, which but anyway, I don't think we'll be implementing those. I like the chocolate powered trains. I think that sounds fun.
One interesting though I was going to say is I actually do know there are some people looking at how to capture methane from cows and capture the CO2. They're currently looking at how to do that. So who knows? Watch this space for that invention.
I think the cow's coming out of climate change really badly, and I'm feeling very sorry for it. One of the things I found quite interesting, someone told me this week that if you embed a document into an email and not attach, you reduce dramatically the energy used. Was that you, Vicky?
It was me. It takes 12 times more energy to attach something to an email than put a link in your email. So if you have the option, do a link, not an attachment, and do your bit for the planet.
Well, there's a takeaway. Look,
every day's a school day, eh?
We've missed Keith. We haven't had the professor with us today, but he'll be with us next month. Tim, you've just been absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for your time and generosity.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And keep going with your work, because the world really needs you to be successful. So it's fantastic. Jenny has been as lovely as ever. Johnny, thank you so much. And Vicky, how you have restrained yourself from saying the Prime Minister flew from 10 Downing Street down to Carbis Bay, I do not know. And I just hope to God he filled the plane up so they could all take the blame. And how lovely of everyone to fly to Carbis Bay, just to give everyone in Cornwall, in that part of Cornwall, COVID, because Andrew Marr and about half of the journalists all came back feeling very poorly with themselves, which is terribly generous. And on that final note, we're back next month. This is from Stantec and Cratus working together. We're really proud to work together. If you've got ideas about what we can do for the future editions, please let us know, and we'll see you next month. Thank you to everyone for taking part.